In a small town where everything was peaceful and unnoticeable, one night shook everything up. Lieutenant Dan Smith, an experienced police officer, stopped his car on the side of the road. Laura James, a high school teacher, was driving, and he found her behavior suspicious. Soon, everything got out of control. The lieutenant pulled out a gun and pointed it at Laura. The next morning, the city was shocked. The news and social media were filled with stories of how Laura, despite the threat and fear, not only defended herself, but also became a symbol of the fight for dignity and justice. Her words that night went viral and opened the eyes of many to the importance of respect and human dignity. I wonder where you are watching this video from and what do you think about this incident? Share your thoughts in the comments. We really appreciate each of you and your opinion is incredibly important to us. It is important for us to know what exactly you are interested in and what you would like to see on our channel. Share your ideas and wishes in the comments, and we will try to make our content even more exciting and useful for you. Thank you for being with us. Enjoy watching. It was a rainy evening in Willowbrook, Missouri, filled with a strange tension. Lieutenant Jackson, a white cop with years of experience on the force, was lounging at a table in a local bar, enjoying a glass of whiskey. He had a reputation for being a strict enforcer, but lately he had been crossing the line more and more often. On the other hand, Kia Lawrence, a young black elementary school teacher, had returned home after a long day at school. That evening, she was rushing home to study for an important lesson. Jackson following her. He was on duty, but that day his anger and aggression were running high like never before. Jackson, seeing Kia struggling to carry her bags, decided he had a reason to intervene. Without any reason, he approached her with a clearly threatening expression on his face. "Hey, you!" he shouted loudly, making Kia jump. She turned around, noticing the coldness in his eyes. "Don't you know you can't leave your car unattended here?" "Sorry, I was just getting ready to go home," Kia replied, trying to remain calm. "I don't have time to talk. I have a lot of work to do." But Jackson was already furious. He started yelling, accusing her of ignoring the law and even threatening to arrest her. Soon his anger turned into something more dangerous. He pulled out a gun and pointed it demonstratively at Kia, shouting, "If you don't stop arguing, I'll use my gun." Kia, in a panic, realized that the situation could quickly spiral out of control. Her eyes were filled with fear and her breathing became ragged. She feared for her life, but tried to remain calm so as not to provoke more violence. Soon, neighbors began to gather around, their whispers and outrage creating an atmosphere of tension. The next day, the town was buzzing about the incident. People from all over Willowbrook began to express their opinions, and it soon became clear that the event had sparked a heated public debate. Local news filled the airwaves with details of the incident. Claims of racism and abuse of power made by some witnesses and activists began to attract public attention. Protests and local discussions became commonplace. Meanwhile, despite the fear and stress, Kia decided to fight for justice. She hired a lawyer and filed an official report about the incident. Her actions were an important step in drawing attention to the problem of racism and abuse of power. But what would happen next and how events would develop remained uncertain. The next day in Willowbrook began to unfold in new colors for the residents. News of what had happened to Kia Lawrence spread quickly, causing a wave of outrage and concern. Television cameras, scorched by the sun, drove past Kia's home, where she was constantly asked questions about the incident. At first, Kia felt like she was on probation, experiencing the pressure of the public and the media. Kia tried to remain calm, but the fear and anxiety from the previous day weighed on her. Every time she crossed the street, she felt like people's eyes were full of judgment and curiosity. Schools began talking about her upcoming trial, adding even more stress to her life. Parents of students discussed the incident at parent-teacher conferences, and some even began to whisper that Kia might be to blame for her heightened awareness attracting the attention of the police. While Kia fought for justice, she faced mixed reactions from her colleagues and friends. Some, while genuinely sympathetic, expressed concern that her actions could negatively impact their own careers. Conversations began at school about how the incident could affect the reputation of the educational institution. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Jackson, although not immediately fired or disciplined, began to gain support from some members of the community. A movement emerged in local communities to support his actions, despite clear evidence of abuse of power. Some argued that Jackson was simply acting under stress and necessity, and that his actions were misunderstood. A few weeks passed, and Kia faced a real storm. A local newspaper published an article that questioned her professional and personal qualities, publishing unverified rumors and distorted information. The school began receiving threatening and accusatory phone calls. Kia felt the social pressure begin to affect her work and personal life. She found that her colleagues began to avoid her, and in some cases, even shunned her, for fear of being caught up in the scandal. The lawsuit she began quickly became a matter of public interest. Public discussions about racism and abuse of power were at their height. Each day brought new challenges, and Kia began to realize that her fight for justice required not only courage, but also incredible resilience. At this time, Jackson, feeling the support of a part of the community, continued his service, not pretending that something had gone wrong. However, not everyone agreed with his actions. Activists, human rights defenders and residents worried about the growing racism began to organize rallies and demonstrations, demanding reforms in the justice system and the police. Each rally attracted more and more people, and the protests became more and more large-scale. As the dust settled, Kia took one last step. She invited the public to engage in dialogue, proposing a public meeting to discuss issues of racism, human rights, and abuse of power. Her goal was not only to seek justice for herself, but also to draw attention to the systemic problems that the incident had exposed. Every day seemed like a step into the unknown, and no one knew how this story would unfold. The faces of people Kia had previously considered friends became less and less familiar, and her own fight for justice turned into a personal cross that she bore with dignity, despite all the difficulties. The pressure on Kia grew with each passing day. Open discussions began at her school, with some teachers and parents expressing dissatisfaction with her actions. Kia felt her professional reputation was beginning to crumble. The constant media attention and public pressure made her life unbearable. She could not safely go out on the street without fear of being photographed or questioned. Local newspapers continued to publish articles criticizing her behavior and pointing out her shortcomings, downplaying the seriousness of what had happened. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Jackson, despite the constant scrutiny and condemnation from some of the community, received support from his colleagues and some local residents. His defenders argued that he was simply following instructions and acting in a difficult situation. In a remote part of town where Jackson was well known and respected, his actions were seen as necessary, not abusive. Kia continued to fight for justice, filing lawsuits and raising awareness of racism, but her efforts were met with resistance. Racial stereotypes and biases began to take center stage. In some corners of the city, discussions turned into debates about whether racism was real or just a private misunderstanding. Heated debates erupted on social media, with both sides presenting their arguments, which only deepened the polarization of society. Jane Brown, one of Kia's neighbors, was worried and protesting police brutality. She was an activist who had long fought against systemic racism in her city. Jane organized rallies aimed at drawing attention to the problems of racism and the need for reform. She used the incident with Kia as an example of how easy it is to fall victim to bias and systemic pressure. With each protest and rally, Kia gained more public support, but also faced increasing backlash from those who didn't want to see change. This time, the focus was on how Kia's story illuminates broader issues of systemic racism, corruption, and abuse of power. The situation was further complicated when it was revealed that Jackson had been cited in several reports of misconduct and suspicious incidents in the past, but none had been properly investigated. This information attracted the attention of human rights groups, which began investigating his career and the police force as a whole. Kia, with her life still under scrutiny, began to look for ways to restore her reputation and continue her work. In her classroom, where her students and their parents were also caught up in the situation, Kia continued to do everything she could to provide education and support to her students. She felt that her fight for justice not only reflected her own destiny, but also the destiny of those who entrusted their future to her. As the trial continued, public opinion remained divided. The trial grew increasingly intense, with each side drawing increasing attention to its arguments. Kia and her attorneys raised issues of racial profiling, bias, and flaws in the justice system. They presented evidence that Jackson's actions were not only wrong, but also reflected a deep problem of racism in law enforcement. Public outrage reached a new level when Kia, along with Jane Brown and other activists, hosted a series of public lectures and panels on racism and systemic issues. These events attracted the attention of not only local residents, but also national media outlets, which began to cover racism and police practices in Willowbrook in detail. Kia thus found herself at the center of not only her own personal ordeal, but also a larger struggle for justice and equality. Every step, every action, became part of a larger struggle to change a system that, as it turned out, needed to be overhauled and reformed. And while the case continued, Kia's future, her career, and public opinion remained in a state of uncertainty. As the trial progressed, tensions in the community continued to mount, both in and outside the courtroom. The situation became increasingly tense. The community was divided into two camps. Some supported Kia and her quest for justice, while others supported Lieutenant Jackson and argued that he was acting within the scope of his job. The trial proved to be a veritable arena for discussing systemic racism and abuse of power. Kia's lawyers presented extensive evidence showing that Jackson had a history of misconduct. They demonstrated how the system often turns a blind eye to such cases, especially when it comes to police officers. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Jackson continued to maintain that his actions were justified. He stated that he was in fear and acting under stress at the time of the incident. However, when Kia's lawyers presented evidence of previous incidents and multiple complaints against Jackson, it became clear that his behavior was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger problem. Despite her courage, Kia faced anger and threats from some in the public. She found that false information about her past and alleged misconduct was being spread on social media. She became the target of smear campaigns that sought to undermine her reputation and discredit her quest for justice. The problem was compounded by deep connections among local officials and Jackson's colleagues that made it difficult to conduct an objective investigation. These connections gave Jackson some protection from possible consequences for his actions. Jackson's supporters argued that the charges against him were politicized and used for personal gain. Amid all these challenges, Kia and her support began to attract national media attention. Several celebrities and public figures spoke out in her support, which helped bring even more attention to her case. The movement for justice, organized by Jane Brown and other activists, gained momentum and became international. Rallies and demonstrations around the world raised issues of racism and systemic oppression, becoming a powerful call for change. The trial continued to move forward, and everyone was eager to see how the case would end. Each day brought new developments, witnesses were called, arguments escalated, and deep discussions about human rights and racial injustice were held. The situation in the courtroom was tense, and every move could affect the outcome of the case. Kia, despite her own fears and worries, continued to fight for justice. She participated in public discussions, emphasizing the importance of reforming the justice system and combating racism. Her life and work became symbols for many people who fought for equality and justice. Jackson, on the other hand, used his connections and support to preserve his career and reputation. He continued to serve despite criticism and found support from those who believed his actions were justified. However, his own position also became a subject of debate, with more and more people questioning how real his motives were and how fairly he used his power. Kia continued to feel the effects of her fight for justice. Threats and slander continued to haunt her, and each day brought new challenges. She found support among activists and allies who helped her cope with the pressure. With each passing day, her story became more emblematic of the fight against racism and abuse of power, but her personal fight for justice remained in the public eye. The case of Kia Lawrence continued to gain momentum, and her story attracted the attention of not only national but also international media. The discussions grew more intense with each passing day, and public protests and rallies around the world continued unabated. Meanwhile, tensions in Willowbrook increased, and deep issues of racism and social injustice began to surface. As the trial continued, events began to unfold in the city that raised questions about how deeply ingrained racism is in the justice system and law enforcement. A documentary that examined racial profiling and police misuse of force took center stage. One segment of the film focused on Kia's case, bringing even more attention to the issues she faced. The documentary featured interviews with race experts, activists, and victims of police violence. Many witnesses confirmed that cases like Kia's are not exceptions, but part of a larger problem of systemic racism. Interviews with experts highlighted that such incidents reflect deep problems with equality and justice. Kia became actively involved in discussions about the film and other public events related to racial justice. She gave interviews and spoke at conferences where she shared her experiences and called for reform. Her words became an important part of the discussion about racism in the United States. She spoke about how bias and racial stereotypes can lead to tragic consequences and the importance of fighting for change in the system. Against this backdrop, new initiatives to reform law enforcement began to emerge. Campaigns for changes in police oversight, transparency, and accountability began in Willowbrook and other cities. Local governments began to consider new measures to improve policing and ensure fairness for all citizens. At the same time, unrest began among the residents of Willowbrook. Supporters of Jackson, who still enjoyed the support of part of the community, organized their own rallies and protests. They claimed that Key's actions were used to incite anti-police sentiment and that Jackson was a victim of media pressure and misunderstanding. These protests often led to clashes with Key's supporters and civil rights activists, which only exacerbated tensions in the city. Kia felt that her struggle was becoming increasingly personal and emotionally draining. Her constant participation in public events and discussions led her to feel her own boundaries blurring. She was under constant pressure and suffered from stress that was caused not only by public discussions, but also by her personal experiences. The problems Kia faced were closely tied to broader structural issues of racism and inequality. Evidence began to emerge during the trial that Jackson and his colleagues were part of a system that systematically turned a blind eye to misconduct and racial bias. Kia's lawyers presented research showing that black citizens often faced disproportionate numbers of stops, searches, and violence from police. The local community began to become increasingly aware of the scope of the problem. Schools and community organizations began to discuss racial inequality and the need for educational programs to eliminate bias and stereotypes. Willowbrook began implementing training for police officers to increase their awareness of racial issues and improve their interactions with the public. However, not everyone was ready for change. Some local government and law enforcement officials resisted the reforms, fearing that they could undermine the authority of the police and lead to more conflicts. In response, activists and human rights defenders continued to fight for greater transparency and accountability in the justice system. Kia Lawrence's case became not only a symbol of her personal struggle, but also an important step towards a more just society. She continued to fight for justice despite all the difficulties and pressures, and her story continued to inspire many people to fight racism and abuse of power. As the Kia Lawrence trial entered a new phase, the situation in Willowbrook continued to escalate. A look at her case not only exposed problems with Lieutenant Jackson's actions, but also revealed broader, deeper systemic problems of racism that permeate law enforcement and community institutions. During the trial, Kia's lawyers presented a range of evidence that questioned the police's actions and showed how racial bias affected their work. One of the most resonant moments in the case was the presentation of a study conducted by independent experts that showed that in Willowbrook, black residents faced significantly higher rates of police stops, searches, and use of force than white citizens. A key witness in the trial was Deborah Miller, a former law enforcement officer who resigned after repeatedly encountering racial bias in her work. She described how, during her time on the force, she saw how racial stereotypes and biases influenced police behavior. She said many officers might perceive black citizens as more likely to commit crimes, which led to aggressive actions and unnecessary arrests. Deborah described how police in Willowbrook often used their powers to exert control over the city's African American neighborhoods, despite no real threats or wrongdoing. She also said that her attempts to raise concerns with her superiors were ignored or suppressed. This testimony added weight to the charges against Jackson and revealed systemic problems that extended far beyond a single incident. In response, Jackson's defense team tried to discount the evidence, arguing that it was part of a broader campaign to discredit the police. They argued that much of the evidence presented was simplistic and did not take into account the complexity of law enforcement. In response, Key's attorneys presented evidence that such problems had been confirmed by multiple independent studies and complaints from local residents. In her quest to expose and illustrate issues of racism, Kia began working with local and national advocacy organizations to host a series of community events and educational programs. She partnered with universities and NGOs to create a platform for discussions on racial bias and systemic oppression. These programs ranged from the history of racism to practical solutions to eliminate bias in various areas of society. One of the most iconic moments occurred when Kia organized an open forum in her community, inviting experts and residents to discuss racism in law enforcement. The forum became a place for people to share their experiences and concerns, and discuss how racial stereotypes and biases impact their lives. The forum attracted a large number of participants and attracted the attention of local officials, which led to a dialogue about the need for reform. Meanwhile, protests continued to occur in the city. Rallies and demonstrations became frequent events, bringing together both Kia's supporters and opponents. These actions brought attention to the problems of racism and helped open new dialogues about the need for reform. However, the protests also led to tensions and conflicts, which complicated the situation. The protesters were not only demanding justice in Kia's specific case, but also reforms to the justice system. They were raising questions about racial bias in police practices, the need for transparency in investigations, and holding accountable those who violate laws and citizens' rights. They were calling for independent oversight bodies that could objectively evaluate police actions and ensure justice. Kia felt that her struggle was emblematic of a much larger issue. She continued to be active in public debate and support various anti-racism initiatives. Despite personal hardships and ongoing stress, she saw her cause as an opportunity to make real change and improve the system. As the trial wound down, public attention focused on how and when needed reforms would be made. Kia and her supporters were seeking not only justice in her personal case, but also to create lasting change that could prevent similar incidents from happening in the future. By the end of the trial, it was clear that the Kia Lawrence case had brought attention to deep systemic problems and had an impact on the public consciousness. The secrets it revealed and the challenges its initiators faced showed how important it is to continue the fight for justice and equality, even when the path to those goals seems difficult and winding. The trial of Kia Lawrence has reached its climax. Public attention was focused on the final session, which promised to be decisive. Both Kia's lawyers and Jackson's defense team presented their closing arguments, and every word seemed charged with tension and emotion. Kia's attorney, Michael Rodriguez, gave a moving speech that emphasized the importance of justice not only for Kia, but for the entire justice system. He explained how Jackson's actions were not just an incident, but part of a deep-seated problem of racial bias. Rodriguez cited data and evidence showing that these types of incidents are happening all over the country and that reform is needed to address systemic racism. Jackson's defense, led by Emily Clark, focused on demonstrating that the lieutenant acted under stress and threat. She argued that his actions were driven by his perception of danger and that he acted within the scope of his professional training. Clark also attempted to argue that many of the allegations of racism were exaggerated and used to create a negative image of the police. As the jury deliberated, the mood in Willowbrook and beyond grew even more tense. The city streets were filled with protesters demanding justice. Local news regularly featured reports of rallies, protests, and demonstrations dedicated to the case of Kia and issues of racial justice. One of the most significant protests was organized by Jane Brown and her allies, who held marches and rallies under the slogans "Justice for Kia" and "Police Under Control." These actions brought attention to the widespread problem of racism in law enforcement and helped maintain high public interest in the case. The trial not only highlighted the specific case, but also became an arena for discussion of deeper issues of racial bias and the need for reform. As a result, several high-profile research organizations and advocacy groups began conducting their own studies and reviews of policing practices in cities, including Willowbrook. These studies confirmed that racial profiling and bias were indeed a serious problem that required comprehensive solutions. Finally, the jury returned with a verdict. They found Jackson guilty of abuse of power and misuse of authority. The decision sparked a wave of public celebration among Kia supporters and civil rights activists, but it also led to a new round of conflict with those who continued to support Jackson's wrongdoing. She also knew that the decision did not address all of the issues surrounding racism and systemic injustice. Her personal struggle was only part of a larger problem, and she felt a responsibility to continue working to reform the system. In the months following the verdict, Kia and her team continued to work hard to create and promote initiatives to improve policing practices and combat racism. They organized a series of educational events and public forums to discuss ways to improve the justice system and ensure fairer treatment for all citizens. These initiatives attracted the attention of legislators and community leaders, which helped to initiate work on law enforcement reform. Willowbrook and other cities began implementing new programs to train police, improve community relations, and create independent oversight bodies. Kia continued to work to keep her case in the public eye, helping to raise awareness nationally and internationally. She worked with various organizations, promoted initiatives to improve justice, and continued to be an active participant in the fight for equality and justice. As time went on, things began to change in Willowbrook. The reforms implemented in the wake of the Kija case began to bear fruit. While the problems of racism and bias did not completely disappear, there were signs that the community and law enforcement were becoming more aware of and addressing these issues. Kia Lawrence has become a symbol of the fight for justice and equality. Her efforts and courage have inspired many people to take action and have drawn attention to important issues that still require solutions. Her story, despite all the trials, has become an example for all those who fight for rights and justice in the modern world. After the sentencing of Jackson and the initial steps toward reform, public attention to the case of Kia Lawrence did not wane. Attention continued to focus on the incident that had set the whole fight in motion: Lieutenant Jackson's threat to a black teacher, Kia Lawrence. The trial and subsequent events unraveled a tangle of complex and systemic issues, but the story began with one tragic moment: the day that Jackson, a white police officer, threatened Kia Lawrence, a black teacher, with a gun. Kia was driving home from a long day at work when Jackson pulled her over and, in his words, noticed something suspicious. This moment in history became emblematic not only of a personal conflict, but of a broader problem of racial bias. Amid the trial and public debate, it became clear that the incident was not a random occurrence, but the result of deep-rooted racial bias and problems in law enforcement. The timeline of events was clear. Kia revisited the day in her memories and chose to share them at public forums and events. She described how her nerves were on edge when Jackson, armed with a gun, approached her car. Kia was shocked that the officer, instead of following standard procedures, immediately resorted to threats. In her eyes, it was more than just an incident. It was a clear example of how racial stereotypes can influence the behavior of law enforcement. All this time, Kia was trying to understand what exactly led to Jackson's violent behavior. In her search for answers, she came across old reports and testimonies that showed that Jackson was part of a system that allowed him and others like him to operate without proper oversight or accountability. This discovery only strengthened her resolve to continue the fight for justice. While the case was ongoing, she also worked with experts who helped her understand how racial stereotypes shape police perceptions and behavior. These experts explained that bias can occur not only in interactions with citizens, but also in police training and decision-making. Research has shown that officers working under stress may be particularly susceptible to racial stereotypes, leading to increased aggression and misconduct. Jackson, however, maintained throughout the trial that his actions were motivated by a sense of threat, not racial bias. He claimed that he acted in accordance with instructions and within his understanding of the situation. His defense argued that his behavior was a result of stress and tension in the situation, and that he had no intention of acting unlawfully. Despite this, however, numerous witnesses and experts have demonstrated that Jackson's behavior was not an isolated incident. Uncovering his history of previous incidents and complaints only confirmed systemic problems. An audit of policing practices in Willowbrook, which was initiated after the Kia case began, found that many other instances of racial profiling and bias were not properly investigated or addressed. Despite personal suffering and constant pressure, Kia continued to inspire others. Her story became a powerful tool for raising questions about the need for reform and addressing systemic problems in law enforcement. Amid growing public outrage and calls for action, signs of change began to emerge. As reforms progressed, Kia continued to raise awareness of issues of racism and bias. She was active in educational campaigns that sought to change perceptions and practices in the community and law enforcement. These campaigns aimed to raise awareness of racial bias and create an environment where people could safely discuss and address these issues. In the end, Kia Lawrence's case was not only a personal victory, but also an important step toward a more just society. While the issues of racism and bias did not go away completely, her fight and efforts led to important changes and helped highlight the need for deep reform. Kia continued to be an active advocate for change, and her story served as a reminder of how important it is to continue the fight for equality and justice. After Jackson was convicted of abuse of power, Willowbrook entered a period of intense change, but behind the social and legal changes were deeper, more complex processes that involved not only politics and the justice system but also individual experiences, public opinion, and cultural change. Kia Lawrence, who became a symbol of the fight for justice, continued to actively work for reform and change. Her life after the verdict was filled with public speaking, meetings with politicians and activists, and constant participation in educational initiatives. She saw her story as an opportunity to make a real change in the public perception of racism and justice. One of her major projects was an initiative to create educational programs for law enforcement and the public. These programs were aimed at eliminating racial bias and raising awareness of systemic problems. Kia collaborated with universities, advocacy organizations, and race experts to develop courses and trainings that would help police and other agencies interact more effectively and fairly with diverse populations. An important part of this work was creating a platform for open discussion of race and bias. Kia organized public discussions where residents of Willowbrook and other cities could share their experiences and concerns. These events helped create a space for dialogue in which participants could discuss how bias impacts their lives and how the system could be changed to make it more equitable. But even with this rise in public awareness, Kia faced personal challenges. Threats and attacks from opponents who considered her fight too radical continued. Some people in her hometown and beyond considered her actions excessive, accusing her of inciting conflict and negatively affecting the police force's reputation. At the same time, the effects of changes in policing practices began to show in Willowbrook. Local officials implemented new protocols to review and monitor police officers to prevent misuse of force. Independent oversight boards were created to investigate incidents and complaints related to policing. These steps led to improved transparency and accountability. Change did not happen overnight, however. Some police officers and city residents continued to resist the reforms, believing them to be unnecessary or unnecessarily expensive. In some cases, resistance to the reforms took the form of active protests and political campaigns aimed at discrediting the proposed changes. However, Kia remained determined and continued her work despite the resistance. She became actively involved in new community initiatives, such as creating programs to improve police relations with the community and working on projects to improve equity and equality in education and employment. Meanwhile, the situation in Willowbrook and other cities across the country remained tense. The process of police reform and the fight against racism was long and difficult. Public discussions, protests, and political battles continued, showing that change takes time and persistence. Kia became known nationally as an activist and advocate for justice. Her work was recognized not only in the United States but also abroad. She continued to speak at international conferences, sharing her experiences and offering solutions that could help other communities and countries overcome similar challenges. These international trips and meetings also brought new opportunities for Kia. She began collaborating with various international human rights organizations, which helped her expand her influence and strengthen her mission. She shared her stories and proposals for reforms and systemic changes that could have a significant impact on a global level. Throughout all of these changes, Kia's personal struggles remain an important part of her story. She continued to find support from friends, family, and allies who helped her cope and stay motivated, but she also faced the internal doubts and fatigue that came with her work and constant public speaking. Her journey was challenging and complex, but Kia knew her efforts could make a real difference. Every event, every encounter, and every step forward strengthened her belief that justice and equality were possible, and that her work mattered for generations to come. Thus, Kia Lawrence's story continued to evolve, reflecting not only her personal struggle but also the broader societal changes that were beginning to transform the justice system and public consciousness in the United States and beyond. While Kia Lawrence continued to actively work for reform and improvement of police practices, her personal life and professional activities remained in the public eye. Her every move and initiative was closely covered by the media, which not only strengthened her status as a symbol of the fight for justice, but also placed additional pressure on her life. Her efforts attracted the attention of major advocacy organizations and politicians, which gave her new impetus to her work. Kia began collaborating with leading experts on human rights and racial justice, which allowed her to delve deeper into issues of systemic change. One of her significant achievements was the creation of a coalition uniting various groups, working to improve conditions in disadvantaged areas and ensure equal access to opportunity. Kia has been active in creating community initiatives focused on education and overcoming bias. She initiated youth education programs that focused on how to confront racism and how to actively work to create a more inclusive society. These programs actively involved local schools and universities, which helped bring ideas of equality and justice to the next generation. In addition, Kia actively collaborated with the media to maintain public interest in issues of racism and bias. Her interviews, articles, and public appearances continued to draw attention to these issues, which contributed to raising public awareness and pressure on the authorities to continue reform. Despite her successes, however, Kia faced constant challenges. Opponents of the reforms continued to question her methods and goals, accusing her of exaggerating problems and destabilizing the social order. These accusations sometimes led to violent protests and smear campaigns, making her work more difficult. Kia also faced personal challenges. The constant media and public attention, as well as pressure from political and social groups, sometimes left her feeling isolated and exhausted. She began to seek support from psychologists and counselors to cope with emotional stress and maintain her mental health. Amid these challenges, a significant development was the publication of a report by an independent commission commissioned by KIJA. The report detailed the problems of racial bias in policing and made recommendations for improvement. It became an important tool for further reform and helped strengthen the case for change. The report also marked a new phase in Kia's work. She and her allies began actively promoting the report's proposals to legislatures, which helped initiate discussions about possible changes to federal and local laws. Working with politicians and legislators became an important part of her work, as she sought to ensure that the proposed reforms were adopted and implemented. Another important step was to collaborate with other activists and organizations working on similar issues in different parts of the country. Kia participated in national forums and conferences where she shared her experiences and looked for new ways to join forces in the fight for justice. These meetings allowed the creation of a national network of activists working on reforms in various areas, which helped strengthen the movement for equality. As reforms and new initiatives progressed, Kia remained active and engaged. She participated in community events, continued to collaborate with the media, and worked hard to expand her influence on the international stage. Her efforts bore fruit. New practices and initiatives aimed at improving police-community relations began to be implemented in various cities. Meanwhile, Willowbrook began to see noticeable changes. The new police protocols created as a result of the reforms began to bear fruit. Public opinion of the police became more positive, and trust in law enforcement began to gradually increase. While issues of racism and bias did not disappear entirely, the new practices helped reduce aggression and increase transparency in policing. Kia remained active and determined. Her work was recognized not only at the local community level, but also at the national level. She inspired many people to begin working on changes in their own cities and countries. So, despite all the difficulties and challenges, Kia Lawrence continued her fight for justice and equality. Her story became a symbol of hope and change, showing how personal courage and perseverance can contribute to meaningful changes in society. Kia knew that her work was not yet done, and she was ready to continue fighting for justice until her goals were achieved. As Lawrence's reform work continued, her focus shifted to expanding the reach of her initiatives and strengthening the supporting infrastructure. One of her key projects was the creation of a national center to study and address racial bias, which would serve as a platform for research, education, and public discourse. Named in honor of victims of racial injustice, the center was an ambitious project to bring together the resources and efforts of various organizations and researchers working in the field of racial justice. It included experts, academics, and practitioners who worked to develop new methods and programs to combat bias at all levels of society. Kia was actively involved in the creation of the center and its activities, helping to formulate its mission and goals. She organized a series of international conferences and workshops that discussed contemporary anti-racism methods, research findings, and successful practices from around the world. These events raised awareness of the problems of racial bias and provided a platform for the exchange of ideas and solutions. As part of the center's work, Kia and her team developed several key initiatives. One was to create training programs for police officers and other public servants that included training in engagement, cultural competence, and conflict management. These programs were aimed at improving interactions between police and the community, as well as reducing instances of racial profiling and bias. Another important area of the center's work was promoting legislative change. Kia worked closely with legislators and advocacy groups to advance legislation aimed at improving the working conditions of the police and creating independent oversight bodies. These efforts helped in the development and passage of new laws and regulations that required greater transparency and accountability from the police. However, not all changes went smoothly. The opposition continued to express discontent and resistance, accusing the reforms of being too radical and destabilizing public order. Protests and campaigns against the proposed changes periodically arose, requiring Kia and her team to work extra hard to defend their work and maintain public dialogue. Kia's personal challenges did not go away either. Constant media and public attention, as well as criticism from opponents, created stress in her life. Despite this, Kia found support in her allies, friends, and family, who helped her cope with difficulties and stay focused on her mission. During one of these difficult times, Kia decided to turn to her own experiences and create a book that would describe her experiences and fight for justice. The book, titled Voice of Justice, A Path to Change, became an important work in which Kia shared her thoughts, experiences, and hopes for the future. In it, she covered both the personal and societal aspects of the fight for equality, giving readers a better understanding of the depth and complexity of the issues she faced. The book was widely acclaimed and was considered an important contribution to the discussion of racial justice. It brought attention to the challenges faced by many people and became a source of inspiration for those who continue to fight for equality and justice. In her work, Kia emphasized the importance of collective efforts and the need to continually work for change. As her work continued to evolve, Kia also took part in various international projects aimed at improving conditions for minorities and promoting human rights. Her international travel and participation in global forums allowed her to share her experiences and expand the impact of her work internationally. In this way, Kia Lawrence's story became an example of how personal struggle and public activism can lead to significant change in society. She continued to be an active participant in the discussion and solution of racial injustice, using her experience and knowledge to inspire others and advance an important cause. Her work left a deep mark on society and served as a catalyst for the continued fight for justice and equality. Following the publication of her book, Kia Lawrence experienced a surge in public interest and recognition. Her work became the basis for many discussions about racial justice and systemic change. However, behind the facade of success and public recognition were difficult and tragic aspects of her personal life. One day, after a successful international seminar on combating racism, Kia returned home expecting to find peace and relaxation, but her personal life began to take a rapid turn for the worse. One of her senior colleagues and close friends, Angelique, who was also an activist and ally, was killed in a brutal attack. This tragic incident shook Kia to the core and left her in complete despair. Angelique was known for her dedication to justice and her efforts to help victims of racial discrimination. Her death not only left a void in Kia's life, but also dealt a serious blow to the entire team working on reform. Shortly after the incident, Kia received threats and was subjected to aggression, which further worsened her condition. An autopsy into Angelique's death revealed that the attack was planned by a group of anti-reformists who considered her work too radical and threatened the stability of their ideas of justice. The tragedy became the catalyst for Kia to reflect deeply and painfully on her mission and its costs. Amidst public pressure and personal anguish, she faced a difficult choice: whether to continue the fight despite the growing threats and violence, or to retreat and try to protect herself and her loved ones. Despite the challenges, Kia took a bold step forward. She used her platform to speak out about the loss of Angelique and its impact on her life and work. Kia spoke publicly about how the tragedy changed her perspective and strengthened her resolve to continue the fight. She organized memorial events and fundraisers in her friend's memory, directing resources to support programs that combat violence and racial discrimination. During these dark times, Kia received support from her supporters, friends and family. Their help and support became an important source of strength for her. At the same time, she faced inner demons and struggled with guilt for not being able to prevent the tragedy. In parallel with the personal challenges, public attention to Kia's case has increased. Amid national mourning over Angelique's murder, a new wave of activism and calls for tougher measures against violence and extremism has emerged. This has led to new legislation and reforms aimed at strengthening the protection of activists' rights and improving measures to counter violence. Kia continued her work despite personal losses and a constant sense of threat. She saw that her efforts and work were beginning to bear fruit, but she knew that the price for these changes was too high. Each new achievement and each step towards reform reminded her of the sacrifices and difficulties she had to endure. Thus, the story of Kia Lawrence became even more complex and tragic, reflecting not only her personal trials but also the broader context of the struggle for justice in society. Her courage and determination to continue to fight despite tragedy and danger inspired many and became an important element in the movement for equality and human rights. After the tragic loss of Angelique, Kia Lawrence found herself in a position where her personal pain and public responsibility intertwined in a complex and difficult struggle. The murder of her friend and comrade was not only a blow to her personal life, but also a shock to the entire activist network, which felt the anger and aggression of opponents of reform. Kia continued to work actively, but her internal state was far from what it had been before. Her nights were filled with anxious thoughts, and her days were filled with intense work and worries. She often faced feelings of guilt and doubts about her ability to cope with the task she had set for herself. To cope with the psychological burden, Kia began attending therapy and seeking help from psychologists who specialize in post-traumatic stress and loss. She realized that in order to continue her work and help others, she needed to first deal with her own inner demons. In the midst of personal hardships, Kia decided to organize a major national event in memory of Angelique. The event was not only an act of respect for the memory of her friend, but also an opportunity to mobilize the public to continue the work of reform. The event brought together thousands of people, from politicians and human rights activists to ordinary citizens, who came to support the idea of justice and equality. During the event, Kia gave a moving speech that not only remembered Angelique's life and legacy, but also emphasized the need to continue working for systemic change. She spoke about how losing a friend strengthened her resolve and how important it is for her work to be more than just a personal mission, but a collective effort for the good of society. In the wake of this event, public attention to issues of racial injustice and violence increased. Kia continued to use her platform to raise awareness of violence, advocate for activists, and fight for stronger measures against abusers. Her work at the National Center for the Study and Elimination of Racial Bias also continued, with a focus on creating effective programs to prevent violence and support victims. Despite her efforts, the problems and challenges did not go away. Kia continued to face threats and attacks, and her work attracted the attention of both reformists and opponents. Sometimes, these threats turned into real attacks, as when her office was set on fire by unknown assailants. As a result of this incident, many of her important documents and research were destroyed, which was a further blow to her work. But Kia and her team did not give up. They began to rebuild and continue their work with new experiences and a renewed determination. Despite all the obstacles, Kia remained an active advocate for reform, working with legislators and human rights advocates to ensure the passage of new laws and policies to improve conditions for minorities and strengthen human rights protections. On the international stage, Kia continued to share her experiences and achievements, drawing attention to issues of racial justice and violence. She collaborated with international organizations to create new initiatives and support global efforts to combat discrimination and human rights violations. Each step forward brought new challenges, but Kia continued to work with determination and courage. Her personal story and her struggle became a symbol of hope and inspiration for many people, and her work had a significant impact on social and legal changes. Thus, the story of Kia Lawrence continued to unfold as a complex and tragic journey filled with both personal losses and significant achievements. She remained not only a symbol of the fight for justice, but also a living example of strength and resilience in the face of adversity. Her life's journey reflected the complexity of the fight for equality and human rights, showing that true change requires not only collective efforts, but also individual determination to overcome difficulties. After the memorial service for Angelique and the series of difficult trials that Kia Lawrence faced, she tried to return to her daily work. However, her personal life and professional activities became even more difficult than before. One evening, when Kia was returning home after a busy day, she was met with more tragic news. Her older brother, Michael, who had been her support during difficult times, had been in an accident. His condition was critical, and doctors did not give much hope for recovery. Michael was not only a close person for Kia, but also an important figure in her life. He was her confidant, friend, and moral support, which helped her cope with difficulties. While Kia was trying to cope with this new blow, her work on reform and advocacy efforts also came under attack. There were new threats and even physical attacks against her office and her team. Amid these threats and the constant pressure, Kia found herself in a state of constant stress and anxiety. Michael, in critical condition, required a significant emotional and physical presence from Kia. The situation in the hospital was unbearably difficult. Kia spent days and nights at her brother's bedside, watching him suffer and endlessly hoping for the best. Her own health began to suffer under the strain of stress and lack of sleep. Doctors reported that Michael had little hope of recovery, adding another layer to her tragic experience. During this same period, her reform work was under threat. Criticism from opposition groups increased, and they began an active campaign to discredit Kia and her work. False accusations and innuendos were made to destroy her reputation. Some of her most trusted allies began to doubt her ability to continue the fight, leading to internal divisions within her team. With each passing day, Kia felt her strength dwindle, with her brother's condition worsening and the pressure on her job growing. Her mental and physical health became critical. Suddenly, her attention was focused on a double tragedy, personal and professional. One night, as Kia sat by Michael's bedside, her phone rang. A message appeared on the screen with a photo of her office, where another of her project centers had been destroyed. The message came with threats that she and her work should be stopped. Desperation and anger overwhelmed her, and she realized that her fight against violence and racism was beginning to take a toll. Michael died a few days later, leaving Kia in deep mourning. The loss of her brother was not only a personal loss, but also an added burden that made her reform efforts even more difficult. Michael's death and the destruction of her office became symbols of the tragedy she had encountered along the way. At Michael's funeral, Kia, despite her devastation, was able to give an emotional speech about how important her brother was to her life and how his loss strengthened her resolve to continue the fight. She emphasized that her work and efforts will continue in Michael's memory and in honor of all those who have suffered from injustice and violence. After the funeral, Kia gathered her strength and continued to work despite the painful losses and challenges. She decided to not give up and continue the fight for justice, using her tragedy as a source of motivation to continue her efforts. Kia knew that her work was of great importance and that she had to keep moving forward to create a more just and equal world. Thus, Kia Lawrence's story takes on an even more dramatic dimension, reflecting not only her personal losses but also the constant challenges she faced in her fight for equality. Her determination and courage became a symbol of the resilience and strength needed to overcome obstacles on the path to justice. After Michael's death and the destruction of her office, Kia Lawrence found herself at the intersection of personal tragedy and professional struggle. She felt devastated, but her inner fire and desire for change still burned despite the emotional and physical exhaustion. Kia returned to her job, but her recovery efforts were complicated by the loss of a vital part of her team, who left due to stress and threats. Her closest allies and friends were concerned about her condition and tried to support her, but they were also overwhelmed. The recovery period was difficult. Kia found solace and support in small but meaningful steps forward. She focused on rebuilding her office and working with the surviving team members who remained committed. Despite the difficult times, Kia tried to remain optimistic and believe in her mission, but her efforts continued to come under attack. Opponents of reform stepped up their efforts, launching new disinformation campaigns and challenging her work. The attacks became increasingly aggressive and personal. One such incident, in which false incriminating materials and threats were found in her office, further increased her sense of isolation and threat. The difficulties at work became part of a bigger picture. The media began to cover her activities from a new angle, often highlighting her personal tragedies and creating sensational headlines. This attracted the attention of not only supporters, but also critics, who began to use her personal problems in their political games. At the same time, her organization was experiencing funding problems within its own organization. In the wake of recent attacks and destruction, many sponsors began to question the safety of their investments. Kia faced a shortfall in funds and was forced to seek new sources of funding, adding another daunting task to her already overloaded schedule. One day, amid these challenges, Kia received an unexpected call from a former colleague offering her the opportunity to attend an important international human rights conference. The offer was a ray of hope in dark times. The conference offered Kia a unique opportunity not only to highlight her achievements, but also to use her influence to push for reform at a higher level. Kia worked tirelessly to prepare for the conference. Her speech was meant to be a keynote, bringing racial justice and activist rights to the attention of the global community. However, despite her efforts, Kia felt overwhelmed and helpless, believing that her loss and struggle no longer had meaning. On the day of the conference, when Kia spoke to a global audience, her speech was full of emotion and personal pain. She spoke about her loss, how her work and personal tragedies were intertwined, and how important it is to continue to fight for justice despite all the difficulties. Her words stirred a storm of emotion and brought attention to the issues she faced. The conference was a turning point for Kia. Her speech attracted international attention and provided new opportunities for her work. The global community began to actively support her initiatives, and new sponsors and partners came to her aid, allowing many of her projects and initiatives to be revived. However, her personal struggles and difficulties did not go away. Kia continued to deal with the emotional burden and stress, finding support from her community and professional help. She knew that her path to justice was fraught with great sacrifice, but she continued to move forward, knowing that her efforts mattered. In the months that followed, Kia Lawrence's work became a symbol of resilience and courage. Her fight continued, and despite the remaining problems and challenges, she remained true to her mission. Her story inspired many, and her work continued to make a real difference in society, demonstrating the strength and determination of someone who would not give up in the face of adversity. Each step forward was difficult, but Kia knew that her work was important not only for herself, but for everyone who had suffered from injustice and violence. Her life became a testament to the strength of spirit and determination in the fight for equality and justice. After the international conference, Kia Lawrence returned to her work with renewed energy and resources, but the challenges of racism and systemic injustice continued to pose serious obstacles. Despite significant achievements, her life and work remained under threat. One of the biggest challenges was the increasingly aggressive resistance from those who saw her reforms as a threat to their status and privileges. Racial prejudice and violence from opponents did not cease, but on the contrary, began to take on increasingly violent forms. Kia faced a whole new set of challenges. One of her new projects, which focused on creating support programs for victims of racial discrimination, was sabotaged. The office where the team was working was found to be full of forged documents and false accusations aimed at discrediting their work. This led to delays and additional stress that Kia and her team had to cope with. Many of her employees began receiving threats, creating an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty about their ability to continue working. At the same time, Kia faced problems on the personal front. The racism and prejudice she faced in her public activities began to be projected onto her personal life. The social network became the site of numerous trolls and aggressive comments aimed not only at her professional achievements, but also at her personal qualities and character. These attacks greatly affected her emotional state and complicated her interaction with the public. Kia also found that her work on education and policing programming and reform was hampered by systemic barriers. She attempted to implement educational programs to train police and educational institutions in anti-racism and inclusivity, but despite positive feedback from some participants, many institutions were not ready for such changes. Local officials and institution leaders often expressed hesitancy and resistance, making it difficult to implement the proposed initiatives. One of the most serious challenges was opposition at the legislative level. The bills proposed by Kia were subjected to harsh criticism and sabotage by opposition politicians. Their efforts to block and delay the consideration of bills had a significant impact on her work and created additional obstacles to reform. Even those bills that were successfully adopted often encountered problems in implementation, as their implementation and control were hampered by systemic shortcomings and political infighting. Kia also faced challenges in expanding her influence and resources. Despite international recognition and support, she found that many large organizations and corporate donors were cautious in their support for fear of backlash from those who opposed reform. This created additional financial strain and made it difficult to implement needed programs and initiatives. Despite these challenges, Kia did not lose hope. She continued to work on projects, organize new campaigns and events to draw attention to the problems of racial injustice. With each new challenge, she became more determined in her fight. Kia also actively sought ways to support her team and keep them safe. She organized safety training for her employees, provided legal protection for those who faced threats, and created support networks to help her colleagues cope with emotional and psychological pressure. Her work continued to show signs of hope and change. Despite resistance, her efforts began to bear fruit in some areas. Some educational and police institutions began to implement new practices, and some local authorities began to acknowledge the need for change. While Kia continued to move forward, her life remained full of challenges and difficulties. Her story continued to be a testament to how personal and professional efforts intertwine in a complex fight for justice. Kia knew that her work was not yet done and was willing to continue to fight despite all the obstacles and difficulties she faced. Kia Lawrence continued to face the endless challenges that racism brought to her life. Despite her resilience and determination, she experienced the effects of racial bias in many different aspects of her life. One day, as Kia was preparing for an important meeting with local government officials, she received news that her daughter, Jade, had been racially abused at school. Jade was a bright, intelligent girl who wore her cultural identity with pride. However, her confidence and joy were shattered when several of her classmates began bullying her because of her race. The trauma Jade had experienced in her emotional state became a significant source of stress for Kia. This situation forced Kia to rethink her perception of the fight for justice. Her personal experiences as a mother became an integral part of her activism. Kia began actively working to create programs to support children who were subjected to racial discrimination in schools. She organized meetings with school administrators to discuss measures to combat bullying and racism. These efforts became an important part of her work, but they also required significant emotional and physical resources. Unfortunately, racism did not escape her own work environment. Kia faced constant obstacles from colleagues and opponents. In her office, despite serious efforts to restore order, there were still cases of subversion and sabotage. Some of her employees began to work for opponents of reform, providing confidential information and creating internal conflicts. Additionally, her work with the media also presented challenges. Racist stereotypes and biases were often present in the media, and Kia found that her words and actions were twisted and used against her. The press often drew on her personal tragedies and used them to create sensational stories, which only increased the pressure and sense of injustice. Her interactions with local authorities were also complicated by racial bias. Some politicians and officials openly expressed hostility to her initiatives and used racist arguments to justify their resistance. This led to protracted bureaucratic processes and the blocking of her reform proposals. Kia also began to notice how her social circle and public opinion had changed. Some of her former friends and acquaintances began to distance themselves from her, fearing association with her activities or suffering from public pressure. This left her feeling isolated and added to her emotional burden. However, Kia found support in new allies and people who shared her vision for justice. These connections became a source of inspiration and strength for her, helping her cope with difficulties and continue her work. She also began working to create support networks for other activists who were facing similar challenges. Kia continued her work despite all the difficulties she experienced. Her work became a powerful testimony to how racism and bias can have a serious impact on a person's life and health. Kia used her experiences to create new initiatives and programs aimed at supporting those who suffered from racial discrimination and continued to fight for change in society despite all the obstacles and difficulties. Each step forward was difficult, but Kia knew her work mattered. She continued to seek ways to expand her influence and raise awareness of racial injustice, hoping that her efforts would lead to long-awaited change. Her life remained full of challenges, but her determination and courage continued to inspire those who faced racism and injustice. The situation surrounding the police officer who initially threatened Kia Lawrence has evolved in a complex and dramatic way. As public attention to her case has grown, the question of the officer's actions has become the focus of legal and public debate. Following the incident in which a police officer threatened Kia with a gun, the public and human rights groups began to actively demand an investigation and a fair trial. Kia and her allies insisted that the officer's actions be subject to strict oversight, and this became a major part of their campaign for law enforcement reform. The officer, James Wright, was suspended pending an investigation. The investigation revealed that Wright had a history of complaints of inappropriate behavior and aggressive behavior towards citizens. These facts only added fuel to the fire of public outrage. The legal battle began with allegations of abuse of power and threats of violence. Kia and her lawyers argued that Wright's actions not only violated her rights but also demonstrated a deeper problem in the law enforcement system that allows racism and violence to permeate everyday practices. In court, Wright tried to justify his actions by arguing that he had acted in response to an alleged threat, but video of the incident posted online and eyewitness accounts cast doubt on his version of events. The trial was long and arduous, with both sides presenting a wealth of evidence and testimony. Reform advocates used the case as an example of systemic problems and called for radical changes in policing. In the midst of the trial, Kia continued her work, continuing to fight for reform and support for victims of racism. During the trial, she managed to draw significant attention to the issues surrounding police violence and racial discrimination. This gave her additional impetus to work on creating new programs and initiatives aimed at preventing such incidents in the future. As a result, the court found James Wright guilty of abuse of power and threat of violence. He was sentenced to probation and was dismissed from law enforcement. This verdict was a significant step in the attempt to restore justice and show that even law enforcement officials must be held accountable for their actions. But for Kia and her team, this was just the beginning. Realizing that punishment alone would not solve the problem of systemic racism and violence in law enforcement, she continued her work on reforms and improving police-community relations. She actively collaborated with legal experts, local authorities, and activists to create and implement new standards and training for police officers. Kia knew that her work and fight for justice was far from over. Despite winning this particular case, she continued to face difficulties and challenges related to racism and bias. However, her efforts to create change and support victims of racial discrimination continued to bear fruit, and her work became increasingly important in the fight for equality and justice. After James Wright was found guilty of abuse of power and threatening violence, his life changed dramatically. The trial and subsequent sentence left an indelible mark on him, and the consequences of his actions continued to haunt him. Following his conviction, Wright was fired from law enforcement, marking the end of his career. This dismissal was only the beginning of a series of difficulties he would begin to experience. He faced public shaming and was left without a job, which dramatically changed his financial situation. In the months following the trial, Wright struggled to adjust to his new life. He and his family moved to another city, hoping to start over with a clean slate. However, the initial attempt to return to normal life proved difficult. Wright and his family faced constant media and public attention. This attention, along with financial problems, created ongoing stress for them. Wright tried to find work in the private sector, but his resume was damaged by the scandal. Many companies and employers, having learned of his past, refused to hire him, fearing negative consequences for their reputation. This made it difficult for him to find a job and led to financial difficulties. Shortly after his firing, Wright began to experience mental health issues. The constant pressure and public shaming had a significant impact on his emotional state. He began seeing a therapist and receiving treatment for depression and anxiety. Working with a psychologist helped him deal with his inner demons and try to understand the reasons behind his actions. His relationship with his family also became strained. The constant media and public attention, as well as financial problems, created additional stressors that affected their family relationships. Some family members began to feel shame and guilt about what had happened, which made the situation worse. In an attempt to find a new direction in his life, Wright began volunteering. He contacted several organizations that worked with victims of violence and racial discrimination and offered his help as a consultant and trainer. This decision was an attempt to atone for his past mistakes and find a way to help others who were facing similar problems. Wright also became actively involved in discussions and seminars on police ethics and accountability. He used his experiences to educate others about the importance of respecting human rights and preventing violence. These efforts were part of his attempt to find redemption and try to improve the public perception of himself. However, rebuilding his reputation proved to be an extremely difficult process. His actions continued to cause controversy and debate in public circles. Many people still considered him reprehensible, despite his attempts to improve and help others. Despite these challenges, Wright continued to work on himself and try to find a new purpose in life. His experiences and attempts to atone became part of his new identity. He knew that changing public opinion and restoring trust would not be easy, but he remained determined in his goal to help others and work to fix the system. Thus, James Wright's life after the incident was full of trials and challenges. His attempts to cope with the consequences of his behavior and find a new path in life were difficult and demanding. He faced deep internal struggles and external condemnation, but he continued to work on himself, striving to find redemption and a positive direction for his life. Several years have passed since James Wright was convicted and fired from law enforcement. During this time, Kia Lawrence continued her work to reform the system and support victims of racial discrimination. Her efforts bore fruit, and many changes began to be implemented in police practices and educational institutions. Kia became a prominent figure in the fight for justice, and her work had a profound impact on the community. Meanwhile, Wright, though he tried to find redemption through volunteer work and educational programs, still faced difficulties. His attempts to restore his reputation and rebuild his life faced many obstacles. Despite his efforts, internal and external conflicts continued to haunt him. One day, after a long period of struggle, Wright was invited to participate in a public discussion on reform and racial discrimination. It was organized by a major human rights organization, and his participation was an unexpected step toward redemption. During the discussion, Wright spoke about his experiences and what he learned about the systemic problems in the police. He shared his understanding of the importance of human rights and the need to change police practices. Kia Lawrence, though surprised by the invitation, agreed to attend the discussion. She understood that reform required constructive dialogue, and Wright's participation could contribute to a deeper understanding of the issue. During the discussion, Wright spoke candidly about his mistakes and how they changed his views on policing and justice. His candor and willingness to admit his mistakes drew mixed reactions from the audience, but many noted that it was an important step in the process of redemption. Kia, despite her own personal pain and experiences, supported Wright's openness. She gave a speech in which she emphasized the importance of forgiveness and the need for further reform. She noted that everyone who has caused harm has the opportunity to make amends and contribute to a better system. Following the discussion, Wright and Kia continued to collaborate. Wright offered his expertise to develop new training and educational programs aimed at preventing police violence and racial discrimination. Kia agreed to collaborate with him, seeing it as an opportunity to improve the system and help others. Wright continued to work on himself and try to make positive changes in society. His life was not without its problems, and his reputation was still controversial, but he found satisfaction in the fact that he could do something useful despite his past mistakes. Kia, for her part, continued her efforts to reform the system and support victims of racism. She knew her work was not done and that there was much more to do, but she also saw in her collaboration with Wright an opportunity for growth and change that could help address underlying issues of racial injustice. Kia and James' story is a testament to how we can overcome difficult challenges and find a path to redemption and change. Their collaboration and work were an important step in the process of creating a more just and inclusive society. And although their path was thorny and difficult, they kept moving forward, hoping for a better future and that their efforts would make a real difference in the lives of others. Over time, the efforts of Kia Lawrence and James Wright began to make a real difference. Their work together on programs to reform police practices and support victims of racism led to significant improvements. Local communities began to see the first fruits of their efforts, the implementation of new standards for working with the public, stricter oversight of police actions, and education programs for law enforcement. Kia continued her work with unceasing energy, conducting trainings and workshops aimed at developing understanding and respect among police and educational workers. Her efforts contributed to the creation of new initiatives and support from human rights organizations and local authorities. She saw how her work affected people's lives, and this gave her the strength to continue the fight. James Wright, though he faced ongoing challenges, found his path to redemption. His work in educational programs and volunteer work allowed him to feel a sense of meaning and purpose in life. Despite reputational issues and personal struggles, he found a way to contribute to social change and help prevent his own mistakes from being repeated. Together, they have proven that even in the most difficult situations, there are ways to change and grow. Their story is an example of how to overcome personal and systemic challenges while working to create a fair and inclusive society. Their paths no longer crossed in their daily work, but they continue to stay in touch and collaborate when needed. Their shared efforts and commitment to justice made them symbols of change and an inspiration to many. The end of this story was not the end of the fight for equality and justice, but it was an important milestone in their lives and in the lives of those who suffered from racial discrimination. Kia and James continued their work, knowing that every step they took was a step toward a better future for everyone. Thank you for watching our video. We hope that the story of Kia Lawrence and James Wright left an impression on you and made you think about the importance of fighting racism and the need for reform. We really want to know your opinion on how this story revealed the topic and what emotions it evoked in you. Please share your thoughts and feelings in the comments. What aspects of the story did you find most meaningful? What did you think of the characters' journeys of redemption and change? Your feedback will help us better understand how to make our content even more relevant and inspiring. Thank you for your support and participation.